In the frozen dark beneath Berlin, more than 1,000 feet under a divided city, the Americans believed they had achieved the impossible. They had turned the Earth itself into a listening device, a hidden artery running from west to east, straight into the nervous system of the Soviet Empire. For 11 months, behind concrete walls and barbed wire, as soldiers smoked cigarettes and streetcars rattled across ruined avenues, every word spoken on certain Soviet military lines did not disappear into the night. It traveled through copper cables, into the soil, across a clandestine tunnel, and up into a secret room where men wearing headphones leaned forward and recorded history in real time. They thought they were invisible. They thought they were winning. They were wrong. Because from the very first conversation, from the moment the idea of the tunnel was whispered in a secure room in London, the Soviets already knew. A British intelligence officer named George Blake, a man who smiled, who shook hands, who walked the corridors of MI6 like any other colleague, had already delivered the secret to the KGB. The greatest technical triumph of the early CIA in Europe was, at the same time, one of its deepest strategic failures. The tunnel under Berlin was both a masterpiece and a trap. Every conversation recorded, every plan overheard, every secret captured was part of a game the Americans did not know they were playing. This is the story of Operation Gold, the Berlin Tunnel. It is the story of how the CIA and its British partners tried to dig their way into the enemy's mind, and how a quiet, unassuming mole in London made sure the enemy was listening right back. It is a story about engineering and betrayal, about courage and naivety, about the illusion of omnipotence in a war of shadows. And it is a story about a question that still haunts intelligence professionals today. When you are sure you are clever, how do you know you are not the one being played? In the early 1950s, Berlin was not just a city, it was a wound. Bombed, divided, occupied, it sat like a scar in the middle of defeated Germany, carved into sectors controlled by the victorious powers of World War II. American, British, and French forces held the western sectors. The Soviets held the east. Yet, despite the checkpoints and flags, despite the uniforms and patrols, Berlin remained an open nerve between two rival systems. Roads crossed the lines. People moved, traded, defected, and spied. And beneath the streets and sidewalks, something even more valuable crossed those invisible borders: information carried by telephone and telegraph cables. For American intelligence, the Soviet Union in the early Cold War was an opaque fortress. Nuclear strategy, troop deployments, political struggles inside the Kremlin, these were questions without reliable answers. Overhead flights were dangerous. Human sources inside the Soviet apparatus were rare and easily compromised. But the Soviets still had to talk to each other. Orders moved from Moscow to the commanders in East Germany. Reports flowed back from garrisons, intelligence units, and political offices. Those messages traveled, in large part, through Berlin, over overhead lines and underground cables linking Moscow with Warsaw, Bucharest, and beyond. American and British signals intelligence officers studied the map of that network and saw possibility. If you could tap those cables, you could listen to the heartbeat of the Soviet military machine. If you could do it without being seen, you could turn Berlin from a symbol of division into the perfect listening post. The city's shattered buildings and chaotic streets, the constant construction and reconstruction, the churn of occupation life, all of it offered cover. In the ruins of the last war, the next war, the secret war could be fought in silence. Yet, simple ideas become complicated quickly in the world of espionage. It was one thing to say, let's tap the Soviet lines. It was another thing to figure out how to reach cables buried deep inside a heavily guarded sector controlled by a paranoid adversary. The Americans had been learning fast since the CIA was created in 1947, but this would demand something beyond standard tradecraft. It would require a fusion of engineering, deception, political will, and raw nerve. It would require a gamble. The initial spark came from the British. They had already carried out a similar operation in Vienna, Operation Silver, where they secretly tapped Soviet lines and harvested valuable intelligence. The concept was proven. And in London, officers from the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and their American counterparts began to explore whether something even bolder might be possible in Berlin. If overhead lines were too visible, they reasoned, perhaps the underground network could be reached from the western side by going under the border rather than over it. These were early days of the Cold War, when risk sometimes looked like courage and sometimes like recklessness. The CIA was still finding its identity. Political leaders in Washington wanted results. They wanted proof that this new agency could operate on a grand scale, that it could produce insights no other arm of government could deliver. Within the CIA, there were officers who believed that technical ingenuity could level the playing field, that machines and clever designs could do what human spies often could not. The Berlin Tunnel idea fit that ambition perfectly. Talk turned to planning meetings, held in secure rooms, attended by carefully chosen personnel. On the British side, one of those officers was George Blake, a rising MI6 case officer with a respectable war record and a calm, intelligent demeanor. On the American side, figures like William "Bill" Harvey, a tough, driven CIA officer, would eventually take the lead in turning concept into operation. They discussed target cables, possible routes, the geology under Berlin, the technical methods needed to tap lines without triggering alarms. They gave the project code name PB jointly on the American side, and eventually Operation Gold as its public label inside Western intelligence. On paper, the obstacles were formidable. The tunnel would have to start in West Berlin, under a cover facility that would not arouse suspicion. It would have to pass beneath the heavily monitored border into East Berlin without triggering Soviet counterintelligence. It would have to reach specific cables buried deep underground. It would need to house, at its far end, an underground chamber where technicians could install taps on dozens of circuits, all while maintaining the illusion that nothing unusual was happening above. The British offered their expertise from Vienna, and the Americans offered resources and manpower. Together, the CIA and MI6 were preparing to dig. What they did not know was that every step of that preparation, every diagram and timing estimate, every target cable identified, was being shared with the KGB by the quiet man from MI6 who sat at the table and took notes. George Blake's path to that room had been shaped by ideology, imprisonment, and a sense of moral crisis. Born in the Netherlands to a British father and Dutch mother, he had lived through war and occupation. During World War II, he had served with the British and had been recruited into the intelligence services. By the early 1950s, he was a trusted officer, fluent in languages, experienced in clandestine work. But something had changed inside him during the Korean War. Captured by North Korean forces exposed to communist ideology and appalled, by his own later account, at the devastation he attributed to Western bombing, Blake crossed a line. He volunteered to spy for the Soviet Union. By the time he returned to British service, he was already a KGB asset. In Moscow's files, he would become known as Agent Diomid. Outwardly, nothing about him looked suspicious. He played his part well, handling assignments and building a reputation as a capable professional. His colleagues trusted him. That trust opened doors, and one of those doors led straight into the planning of the Berlin Tunnel. When Blake attended the early meetings about the project, he was not just a spectator, he was a conduit. As targets were identified and concepts refined, he passed the details on to his KGB handlers. According to later accounts, he gave them maps, route proposals, technical outlines of the taps, even identification of key personnel. Before a single shovel entered the ground in Berlin, the KGB knew that the CIA and MI6 were preparing to tunnel under East Berlin to reach Soviet cables. From a counterintelligence perspective, this presented the Soviets with a dilemma. On the one hand, the tunnel represented a direct threat to the secrecy of Soviet military communications in a crucial theater. On the other hand, exposing the tunnel too early would risk revealing Blake's existence. A mole inside MI6 who could report on multiple Western operations was far more valuable than any single set of compromised cables. The KGB had to choose what mattered more: the confidentiality of certain communications, or the continued access to the heart of Western planning. They chose the mole. This decision would define the story of Operation Gold. While the Americans and British believed they were conducting one of the most daring intelligence coups of the Cold War, the KGB was watching their progress in near real time, calculating when and how to end the game without exposing their prize asset. It was a chilling inversion of control. The West thought it held the initiative. In reality, the East did. In January 1954, CIA Director Allen Dulles gave formal approval for the Berlin Tunnel project. Within weeks, work began. The Americans established cover in West Berlin using a U.S. Air Force radar site and warehouse. Officially, it was a technical installation dedicated to routine communications work. Unofficially, it was the staging ground for one of the most complex engineering feats the agency had ever attempted. Engineers and construction crews had to remove thousands of tons of soil without attracting notice. Over the course of a year, they would quietly excavate approximately 3,100 tons, reinforcing the tunnel with 125 tons of steel plate and injecting around 1,000 cubic yards of grout to stabilize the structure. The finished tunnel extended roughly 1,276 feet, a hidden tube stretching from the American sector into the Soviet-controlled East. Every foot was a risk. Every day of work was a potential catastrophe if the Soviets detected abnormal activity near the border. Yet, in a strange way, the geography of Berlin helped them. The ground was already scarred by war and reconstruction. Heavy machinery, trucks, building materials, these were familiar sights in a city rebuilding itself from rubble. Under the cover of that constant motion, the CIA's project moved forward. Workers were carefully compartmented. Many did not know the true purpose of the structure they were creating. They followed instructions, reinforced walls, laid floor sections, and left the deeper meaning of their labor to others. Within the tunnel, conditions could be claustrophobic. The corridor had to be large enough to allow men and equipment to move, but small enough to minimize the volume of excavation. Ventilation and drainage were constant concerns. All the while, the border above remained an existential threat. Soviet soldiers patrolled nearby streets. East German security services watched for irregularities. If anyone noticed subtle ground disturbances or unexplained vibrations, they might investigate. Underground, in silence, American and British engineers pushed forward, trusting in their calculations and in the notion that their enemy's attention was elsewhere. It was not. The KGB, informed by Blake, knew exactly what was happening. According to later analysis, they could have intervened. They could have instructed Soviet security forces or East German police to discover suspicious activity and shut it down. They did not. Instead, they monitored, waited, and allowed the work to continue. For them, the longer the tunnel remained undiscovered, the more opportunities Blake would have to prove his worth, and the more they could study Western technical methods without revealing their own hand. By early 1955, the tunnel was complete. At its far end, beneath East Berlin, engineers had created an underground chamber where specialized British technicians could access the target cables. Their mission was delicate: to expose selected circuits, attach taps, and ensure that the small changes they introduced would not alter the signal in a way that would alert Soviet technicians. When they finished, hundreds of circuits, 412 lines by some later counts, were connected to equipment that carried their traffic back through the tunnel into West Berlin. In May 1955, the taps went live. Inside a secure facility on the western side, teams of American and British linguists and analysts began listening. Voices spoke in Russian, in coded phrases, in routine administrative chatter and urgent military instructions. Orders moved from Soviet headquarters to field units, logistics problems, operational reports, disciplinary issues. This was the raw material of the Soviet military mind. To the men in that room, hearing those conversations for the first time felt like pulling back a curtain. Over the next 11 months, the operation would intercept an enormous volume of communications. Later accounts describe roughly 443,000 phone calls captured and recorded, filling tens of thousands of reels of magnetic tape. Every day, fresh conversations arrived. Some were mundane, even boring. Discussions of vehicle repairs, supply shortages, routine scheduling. Others hinted at deeper currents, changes in readiness levels, movements of units, glimpses into how Soviet officers perceived their adversaries and their own chain of command. The tunnel became, in effect, a time-delayed mirror. What was spoken in East Berlin echoed in West Berlin moments later, transformed from sound waves in a handset to electrical pulses in a cable, then back to sound in the ears of Anglo-American analysts. They categorized, translated, transcribed. Intelligence reports were compiled and sent up the chain to military planners and policymakers in Washington and London. The operation, from their perspective, was working. Inside the CIA, pride grew. This was exactly the kind of creative, technically sophisticated operation that senior leaders believed would prove the agency's value. The Berlin Tunnel seemed to be delivering insights into Soviet capabilities and weaknesses that no other collection method could match. It suggested gaps between Soviet propaganda and practical realities, showed patterns of inefficiency, and offered a more grounded picture of the actual state of forces in Eastern Europe. The tunnel was, to many, a triumph. But beneath that triumph lay an invisible flaw. Unknown to the people celebrating the operation's success, the enemy had known about the taps from the beginning. The question that would haunt historians later is this: how much of what passed through those lines during those months was natural, and how much was shaped by the Soviets' awareness that someone might be listening? When an intelligence operation produces vast quantities of raw data, the real challenge shifts from collection to understanding. In West Berlin and back in processing centers, the CIA and its partners now faced mountains of recordings and transcripts. Analysts worked long hours to sift meaningful patterns from the noise. They identified recurring themes, tracked individual officers' voices, and mapped connections between units and commands based on who called whom and when. From this labor came a clearer picture of Soviet military life in East Germany. The intercepted calls revealed chronic logistical problems, equipment shortages, and bureaucratic friction. They captured moments of frustration, where officers complained about unrealistic demands from above. They documented exercises, troop movements, and the rhythms of readiness and relaxation. For Western planners, this intelligence was invaluable. It suggested that the Soviet war machine, while formidable on paper, faced significant internal strains in practice. There was also strategic value in understanding not just capabilities, but mindset. The tone of conversations, the topics prioritized, the way subordinates spoke to superiors, all of this added layers to the West's understanding of its adversary. The tunnel's output helped shape assessments of Soviet intentions, reaction patterns, and organizational culture, influencing how NATO planners thought about deterrence and escalation. Yet, at the same time, no one on the Western side knew they were working under a false assumption, that the Soviets were unaware. Without that knowledge, analysts treated the intercepted lines as a mostly authentic window. After the operation became public, and after Blake's betrayal was revealed years later, experts would argue over how clean the take had been. Some feared that the KGB might have used the tunnel to feed disinformation. Others, examining both Western and later Soviet records, concluded that, for the most part, the communications were genuine. The KGB, prioritizing Blake's protection and their own internal secrecy, did not appear to have systematically manipulated those particular lines to deceive the West. This paradox gave Operation Gold its strange legacy. It was, simultaneously, an operation fatally compromised at birth and a source of genuinely useful intelligence. The CIA and MI6 had built a technical marvel. The KGB had known about it but chose not to ruin it, and in doing so, allowed it to function as intended. The tunnel became a kind of shared secret asymmetry. Each side knew something crucial that the other did not, and each misjudged parts of the equation. Here's the question that hangs over this moment. If you were an intelligence chief on either side, knowing what you know now, would you have made the same choices? Would you risk the safety of a mole to shut down a leak? Or would you gamble that you could manage the damage while preserving your most precious human source? Inside the KGB, the Berlin Tunnel posed a chronic, uncomfortable problem. Blake's reports ensured that senior Soviet counterintelligence officers understood the operation's scope and location. They knew that Western intelligence was physically inside their communications network, listening to sensitive military discussions. Every day the tunnel remained in operation, more information bled into Western hands. Yet every step they took to address the situation risked the thing they valued most: the secrecy of Blake himself. The KGB's leadership made a remarkable decision. They largely kept knowledge of the tunnel restricted, even from other parts of the Soviet and East German security apparatus. According to later research, agencies like the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service, and the East German Stasi were not fully informed. That meant many of the very people whose communications were being intercepted did not know they were vulnerable. They continued to use compromised lines as usual, combining routine communications with the occasional high-level discussion. The KGB sacrificed some operational security in order to shield their asset at MI6 and to avoid sharing sensitive knowledge with rival institutions. From their perspective, there were compensations. First, Blake continued to supply them with information far beyond the tunnel. He compromised other Western operations and assets, and his value grew as years passed. Second, by watching how the West ran Operation Gold, they could learn about American and British technical capabilities and methods. Without publicly challenging the tunnel, the Soviets could quietly study the tradecraft, the engineering, and the patterns of Western action in Berlin. Still, they needed an endgame. The longer the tunnel remained undetected, the greater the chance that someone on their own side would stumble across anomalies in the communication network, unexplained technical issues, subtle voltage changes, or maintenance problems that might lead to investigative digging. At some point, the KGB would have to orchestrate a discovery that looked natural, one that would shut down the tunnel without pointing back to Blake. The planning of that discovery became a case study in controlled exposure. The Soviets would have to decide when enough was enough, when the intelligence loss outweighed the mole's protection, and then stage an incident that could be sold to the world as an accident or routine repair. The KGB wanted a propaganda victory, but they wanted it on their terms. In April 1956, after nearly 11 months of active tapping, the tunnel's life came to an abrupt and dramatic end. Soviet and East German workers appeared near the section of East Berlin under which the chamber was located, ostensibly to repair faulty underground cables. While digging, they uncovered the concealed space containing Western tapping equipment. Within hours, photographs of the bizarre installation, complete with cables, taps, and technical gear, began to circulate inside the Soviet bloc. Publicly, Soviet authorities denounced the tunnel as an outrageous violation of sovereignty, an act of espionage that proved Western hypocrisy. They staged press events, invited journalists, and encouraged outrage. The discovery was portrayed as a triumph of vigilance by Soviet and East German technicians who had supposedly detected irregularities and traced them to a covert Western operation. For domestic and international audiences, the tunnel became a symbol of Western intrusion. Privately, the KGB's goal had already been met. They had shut down the operation without revealing how long they had known about it and without exposing Blake. The narrative of accidental discovery during routine repairs protected their mole by providing a plausible explanation that did not require internal betrayal. Western intelligence agencies, embarrassed by the exposure, had to scramble to assess what damage had been done and to determine whether their adversaries had known all along. On the American side, CIA officials tried to salvage some pride from the situation. They emphasized the technical sophistication of the tunnel, the audacity of the project, and the intelligence it had produced in the months before its exposure. Inside the agency, there were conflicting feelings. Frustration at the operation's compromise, but also recognition that by their own criteria, the tunnel had yielded valuable results. The exposure was a blow, but it did not erase the insight gained. For the British, the emotional landscape was even more complicated. At the time of the tunnel's discovery, They did not yet know that one of their own officers had betrayed the project from the start. To them, it looked like a technical or security failure on the ground in Berlin. The idea that the leak might be sitting quietly in an office back in London, continuing to attend meetings about other operations, had not yet fully emerged. It would take several more years before the full extent of George Blake's betrayal, including his role in Operation Gold's compromise, came into focus. In the early 1960s, information from a Soviet defector led British counterintelligence to suspect that a high-level mole was operating inside MI6. Investigations narrowed their focus, and Blake eventually came under suspicion. When confronted with evidence, Blake confessed. The confession was sweeping. He admitted to having spied for the Soviets for years, compromising not only the Berlin Tunnel, but also dozens of Western agents and operations. For British intelligence, the revelations were devastating. Colleagues had to reckon with the fact that a man they had trusted, who had sat in sensitive meetings, shared lunches, and worked alongside them, had been secretly working for the other side. In the context of Operation Gold, Blake's confession retroactively reframed the entire story. What had been seen as a daring operation cut short by Soviet technical detection now looked like an operation doomed from the beginning by a mole in its planning process. The accidental discovery in 1956, once taken at face value, now appeared more likely to have been carefully orchestrated by the KGB at a time of their choosing, precisely to protect Blake. Blake was tried in the United Kingdom and, in 1961, sentenced to a long prison term. Judges effectively stacked sentences to create a sentence of 42 years, reflecting the scale of his betrayal. Yet even that story would take another twist. In 1966, with the help of accomplices, Blake escaped from prison and eventually made his way to the Soviet Union, where he lived out the rest of his life as a celebrated defector. For the West, the escape was another humiliation, a reminder of how deeply this one man's choices had cut. Operation Gold, already controversial within intelligence circles, now took on a more ambiguous moral and operational meaning. On one level, it remained an example of technical boldness and creative engineering. On another, it stood as a monument to the vulnerability that comes when an adversary infiltrates your inner circle. The tunnel was no longer just a story about ingenuity. It was also a story about trust and its catastrophic failure. Inside the CIA, the aftermath of the Berlin Tunnel's exposure and Blake's later confession forced a harsh internal reckoning. On the surface, the agency continued to point to the operation as evidence of what its officers could achieve under difficult conditions. The sheer technical scale of the project, the logistical complexity, and the volume of captured intelligence were undeniable. In official histories, the Berlin Tunnel would be remembered as one of the most ambitious operations of the early Cold War. But within the walls of Langley, questions multiplied. How had a joint operation of this magnitude been compromised before it even began? Why had Western services not detected Blake earlier? What lessons did the agency need to learn about counterintelligence, compartmentation, and the balance between human sources and technical collection? One uncomfortable truth was that the tunnel operation had depended heavily on trust between allies and within organizations. The CIA had relied on MI6's personnel and experience, while MI6 had assumed that its own officers were loyal. Compartmentation existed, but the very nature of a planning group meant that certain individuals had to be in the room. Blake, by being that kind of officer, had slipped into a position where he could see enough to cause enormous damage. In the years that followed, the CIA expanded its focus on internal security and vetting, and it engaged more deeply in counterintelligence work to detect foreign penetrations. The Berlin Tunnel became a case study in the necessity of questioning assumptions, even about your own side. Technical operations, no matter how cleverly designed, could be fatally undermined by a single human being with the right access and the wrong loyalties. At the same time, the CIA had to decide how to evaluate the tunnel's outcomes. Subsequent studies, including declassified internal histories, concluded that the Soviets had not used the tapped lines systematically to feed disinformation. The intelligence collected had genuine value. It revealed real weaknesses and problems within Soviet forces and contributed to a more nuanced understanding of Soviet capabilities. In that sense, intelligence officers argued the operation had been a success, even if it had been compromised. The phrase successful failure or most successful failure would emerge in commentary about Operation Gold, a mission that, on the one hand, had been betrayed from inception, yet on the other hand had still delivered meaningful, actionable insights. That paradox became part of the CIA's institutional memory. Beyond the technical story and the human drama, Operation Gold mattered because of what it revealed about how the CIA and its adversaries thought about power. In the early 1950s, nuclear weapons and massive armies dominated public discussions of the Cold War. But beneath that visible layer, intelligence agencies were fighting a quieter struggle to understand the other side's true position. The Berlin Tunnel was one of the tools the CIA used to penetrate the fog. By listening to Soviet communications, the agency gained, for the first time, a sustained and detailed stream of information about the day-to-day functioning of Warsaw Pact forces in East Germany. This helped calibrate Western estimates of Soviet readiness and logistical resilience. It suggested that while the Soviet military was large and heavily armed, it also faced chronic issues of maintenance, supply, and organizational efficiency. That knowledge affected how NATO thought about both deterrence and the risks of miscalculation. The tunnel also demonstrated the CIA's willingness to invest in high-risk, high-cost technical operations. More than a year of construction, millions of dollars, complex coordination with Britain, tight secrecy, and intense political sensitivity, all these elements were accepted as the price of gaining an edge. Intelligence, in this vision, was not just about individual spies passing envelopes in dark alleys. It was about engineering projects on the scale of infrastructure, built in silence, visible to almost no one. Yet the KGB's response showed a different kind of power. Instead of smashing the tunnel immediately, they used their knowledge to protect a mole who could influence multiple Western operations across years. They chose patience over spectacle, strategic depth over tactical gain. In doing so, they accepted some intelligence loss as the cost of preserving a unique human asset. That decision highlights a fundamental tension inside intelligence work: the trade-off between securing your communications and exploiting your enemy's vulnerabilities in deeper, more far-reaching ways. The Berlin Tunnel thus became a mirror held up to both sides' doctrines. The CIA's strategy emphasized technical innovation and bold physical operations, while the KGB's response emphasized human penetration and long-term positioning. Both sides valued deception, but in different ways. And both sides, in their own narratives, claimed victory. The West pointed to the real intelligence it had gained. The Soviets pointed to the fact that they had allowed a massive operation to run on their territory under their gaze, then exposed it at a time of their choosing. If you step back from the maps and transcripts, Operation Gold also reads as a psychological drama. On the American and British side, there was a deep desire to pierce the Iron Curtain, to prove that the secretive Soviet system could be penetrated. The tunnel symbolized that desire. It said, "We can reach you, even under your own feet." It was an assertion of control, a statement that superior engineering and planning could erase the advantages of geography and secrecy. For the Soviet leadership, the tunnel, once discovered, became a weapon of propaganda. By showcasing the operation to the world, they portrayed the West as aggressive, duplicitous, and untrustworthy. They told their citizens and sympathizers abroad, "See, we were right. The enemy violates our sovereignty and spies on us even in peacetime." The tunnel's existence, stripped of context, became a simple story that served the regime's narrative of encirclement and justified their own repressive measures. Inside the agencies, the psychological stakes were more personal. Imagine being a CIA officer who had poured years into this project, who had believed in its importance, who had watched the transcripts accumulate and felt pride in each report sent to Washington. Then imagine learning, years later, that a KGB mole had compromised you from the start. The sense of achievement would now be accompanied by an ache of violation, a retroactive realization that you had been operating under an illusion of secrecy. On the Soviet side, consider the officers and technicians whose conversations had been intercepted without their knowledge. For many, the discovery of the tunnel would have triggered paranoia about what else might be compromised. Who was listening? Who was passing information? If a tunnel could run under a border, what other invisible vulnerabilities might exist? The revelations supported the KGB's internal messaging that the enemy was always watching and justified intensified surveillance and control. Psychological warfare, then, did not just occur in public speeches and broadcasts. It unfolded inside institutions and individuals, taking the form of doubt, pride, humiliation, and resolve. Operation Gold amplified all of these emotions. It made intelligence officers on both sides more aware of their own fallibility, more determined to protect their secrets, and more suspicious of their own colleagues. What would you do if you discovered that the operation you considered your greatest achievement had been compromised by someone you drank coffee with every day? The Berlin Tunnel did more than provide a dramatic story. It offered a dense set of tradecraft lessons that would influence future operations. One of the clearest lessons was about compartmentation. The more people who know critical details, the easier it is for an adversary mole to compromise an operation. In the tunnel case, Blake's presence at early planning meetings gave the KGB a comprehensive view of the concept, targets, and execution. Later operations would increasingly restrict knowledge to smaller circles, divide tasks, and treat internal security as a core element of planning, not an afterthought. Another lesson concerned the interplay between human sources and technical collection. The tunnel itself was a triumph of engineering and logistics, but the entire operation was ultimately governed by a human factor, the loyalty or disloyalty of one person. That reality reinforced a sober truth inside intelligence agencies. No matter how sophisticated your technology, humans remain both your greatest asset and your greatest vulnerability. Advanced gadgets, encryption systems, and covert tunnels can be undone by a single mind changing sides. The operation also spurred refinements in signals intelligence processing. Handling 443,000 intercepted conversations and thousands of circuits pushed the CIA and its partners to improve systems for recording, indexing, and analyzing communications traffic. This experience would feed into broader developments in how Western intelligence handled large data sets. The tunnel was an early indication of the coming age in which collection capacity would outstrip human ability to process everything manually, pushing agencies toward more structured methods of triage and analysis. On the Soviet side, Operation Gold prompted renewed focus on cable security and anomaly detection. The fact that Western TAPs had operated for nearly a year meant that Soviet technical protection measures and inspection routines had failed to identify subtle changes introduced into the network. After the discovery, there was greater emphasis on monitoring for voltage anomalies, physical alterations, and other signs of tampering. The tunnel thus acted as a painful teacher to both sides, making them more cautious and more technically vigilant. In the long arc of Cold War espionage, later operations, whether overhead reconnaissance satellites, sophisticated listening posts, or advanced encryption-breaking efforts, carried echoes of Berlin's lesson. Boldness must be matched by ruthless scrutiny of your own assumptions and vulnerabilities. The tunnel showed that technical brilliance is not enough. You also need defensive paranoia. Behind the equipment and the headlines, Operation Gold had a human cost that rarely appears in official summaries. Every reel of intercepted tape represented hours of someone's life spent listening, transcribing, translating, and analyzing. Linguists immersed themselves in the voices of Soviet officers they would never meet, learning their speech patterns, their frustrations, their quirks. Over months, those voices became strangely familiar, almost like characters in a drama that unfolded one phone call at a time. On the Soviet side, the intercepted calls captured moments of ordinary humanity amidst military routine. An officer worrying about supplies might mention his family in passing. Another might joke darkly about the state of his equipment. These fragments, preserved in Western archives, hint at a truth often buried under geopolitics. The Cold War was fought by individuals on both sides who were trying to navigate their roles in vast, impersonal systems. Then there were the casualties of Blake's broader espionage. While Operation Gold itself was a technical operation, Blake's betrayals extended to human agents, people who risked their lives to spy for the West and were arrested, imprisoned, or executed as a result of his reporting. When we talk about the Berlin Tunnel being compromised, we are also talking about a wider pattern of damage that rippled outward into the lives of those caught in the crossfire of secret loyalties. For Blake himself, the decision to spy for the Soviets came with psychological weight. In his own later accounts, he tried to justify his actions as rooted in moral conviction, arguing that he believed he was helping prevent a greater catastrophe. Whether one accepts his justification or not, it is clear that he lived a double life for years, maintaining relationships and routines in the West while secretly reporting to the KGB. That duplicity is its own form of psychological warfare, waged not just against institutions but within a person. The tunnel, in this sense, becomes a symbol of layered human experiences: the pride of engineers and analysts, the fear and anger of betrayed colleagues, the invisible suffering of exposed agents, the conflicted conscience of a mole. It reminds us that intelligence history is not only about operations and outcomes, but about what those operations do to the people involved. Decades after its closure, Operation Gold remains one of the most discussed and analyzed CIA operations of the early Cold War. Declassified CIA museum exhibits and official histories now describe the Berlin Tunnel in detail, acknowledging both the KGB's foreknowledge and the operation's real intelligence value. What was once among the most closely held secrets of the Western intelligence community has become a case study for new generations of officers. In training programs and internal discussions, the tunnel is used to illustrate several enduring themes. One is the importance of anticipating your adversary's perspective. Western planners, focused on technical and logistical challenges, assumed that secrecy could be maintained if construction was well concealed. They did not fully consider the possibility that a human leak at a very high level could render their physical precautions moot. That blind spot is now part of the story told to young officers. You must always assume that your adversary might know more than you think. Another theme is the ambiguity of success in intelligence work. The Berlin Tunnel was compromised, yet fruitful. It was misled at its inception, yet effective in practice. It gave the West genuine insight into Soviet forces, yet it also gave the Soviets insight into Western methods and vulnerabilities. This duality challenges simplistic narratives of victory and defeat. In the realm of espionage, you can win and lose at the same time, often in ways you only understand in retrospect. The operation also occupies a symbolic place in the public imagination. As parts of its story became known through declassification, books, and documentaries, it captured attention precisely because it combined cinematic elements, secret tunnels, listening rooms, double agents, with real-world consequences. For many people, the image of a hidden passage beneath a divided city, built to listen to the enemy, encapsulates the essence of Cold War espionage. For the CIA, embracing this history openly, the triumphs and the failures, is part of an institutional evolution. Official stories now acknowledge that the KGB knew from the start that the moles sat in the planning room, and that the operation's exposure was not just a story of Soviet surveillance teams stumbling upon a cable fault. That transparency serves not only the public, but the agency's own need to learn from its past. Today, the technologies of intelligence collection have advanced far beyond copper cables and physical tunnels. Cyber operations can penetrate networks from continents away. Satellites can capture images with astonishing resolution. Signals intelligence systems sift through staggering volumes of data automatically. Yet the core dilemma that haunted Operation Gold remains unchanged. How do you know when your access is genuine and when it is being managed by an adversary who is letting you see what they want you to see? Modern intelligence officers studying the Berlin Tunnel see clear parallels to contemporary operations. A sophisticated cyber intrusion into an adversary's systems might feel, at first, like a private window into their inner workings. But what if they have detected the intrusion and decided to let it run? What if they are feeding manipulated data or selectively allowing certain information through? The Berlin Tunnel warns that the comfort of access can be a trap. Another echo lies in the continued importance of human sources. Even in an era dominated by digital interception, a single insider like Blake can still alter the balance of power by revealing plans, methods, or vulnerabilities. The tension between trusting your own people and guarding against internal threats persists. Agencies now invest heavily in vetting, monitoring, and internal counterintelligence, but the risk can never be reduced to zero. Every major penetration case in the decades since, from other moles to insider leaks, reflects the same underlying truths the tunnel story laid bare. The Berlin Tunnel also serves as a reminder that intelligence operations are judged not only by their immediate outputs, but by their long-term strategic impact. The insights drawn from Soviet communications in the 1950s contributed to a more realistic understanding of Soviet strength and weakness, shaping Western policy in subtle ways. In the same way, modern operations may have effects that only become apparent years later, when crises emerge or declassified records reveal which assumptions were accurate. As we look back, the tunnel is no longer just a Cold War curiosity. It is a reference point, a case that intelligence professionals and historians return to when grappling with questions about deception, trust, and the blurred line between success and failure in secret warfare. Beneath the strategic calculations and operational details, Operation Gold raises moral questions that are as uncomfortable as they are unavoidable. Intelligence agencies exist to protect their nations by obtaining information others wish to keep hidden. That mission often involves intruding into private communications, deceiving adversaries and sometimes allies, and placing lives at risk. The Berlin Tunnel is a pure expression of that mission, a deliberate violation of an opponent's communications infrastructure in peacetime, conducted in secret, justified by fear of a future war. From the perspective of the CIA and MI6, the operation was certainly defensible. The early 1950s were a period of deep insecurity. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Crises in Europe and beyond threatened escalation. Leaders in Washington and London believed that better intelligence could prevent miscalculation and maybe even avert catastrophe. In that light, tapping Soviet military lines looked like a lesser evil, a way to see clearly in a dangerous world. From the Soviet perspective, however, the tunnel was ammunition for a narrative of Western aggression. They pointed to it as proof that the capitalist bloc could not be trusted, that it would violate agreements and sovereignty whenever it suited its interests. This perspective, in turn, was used to justify their own repression, surveillance, and expansionist policies. Espionage becomes, in this cycle, both a cause and an effect of mutual distrust. And then there is Blake. He believed, or said he believed, that his actions were morally justified, that he was redressing what he saw as Western wrongs by giving secrets to the Soviet Union. His betrayal facilitated the arrest and suffering of people who had taken their own moral risks to oppose communist regimes. He sat in meetings about the Berlin Tunnel and others, knowing that his colleagues trusted him. He chose his side and accepted the consequences for others. Whether he saw himself as a traitor or a man of conscience, his story forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that moral certainty in the world of espionage can be a dangerous thing. If you are still with this story now, ask yourself, when both sides claim moral justification for violating each other's secrets, where do you, personally, draw the line? And what does that answer say about the kind of world you believe we live in? Stories like Operation Gold do not belong only to archivists and intelligence professionals. They belong to all of us because they shaped the world we inherited. Hidden tunnels, secret cables, moles, and counterintelligence decisions, all of these elements influenced how the Cold War unfolded, how close we came to catastrophe, and how power was exercised in our name. If you value this kind of deep, documented journey into the secret history of the Cold War and the intelligence world, it helps more than you might think to stay connected. Subscribing to this channel tells the algorithm, and more importantly, tells us, that there is an audience that wants serious, carefully sourced stories instead of shallow myth. And if you feel like adding your own perspective, take a moment to comment with a simple answer to this. Do you think Operation Gold was ultimately worth it, knowing it was compromised from the start? Your reactions, your questions, your disagreements, they are part of the conversation about what intelligence agencies should and should not do in a democracy. The shadow war under Berlin may be over, but the debate it represents is very much alive. In the end, the Berlin Tunnel is more than a line in a history book. It is a symbol of the contradictions at the heart of intelligence work. It shows us an agency willing to move mountains of earth in secret, to build an underground bridge into enemy territory, to invest in engineers and linguists and cover stories, all in the hope of seeing more clearly in a dark time. It also shows us how fragile that clarity can be when one person on the inside chooses a different loyalty. The KGB's decision to protect Blake rather than immediately destroy the tunnel underscores a hard truth. In espionage, information is not just about what you gain, but what you are willing to risk. The Soviets risked some exposure of their communications to preserve a mole who could betray far more. The West risked exposure and embarrassment to gain access to those communications in the first place. Each side gambled. Each side won something. Each side lost something. As we close this story, picture the tunnel not as a physical structure, but as a metaphor, a narrow, fragile passage between two worlds that do not trust each other, built in darkness, maintained in secrecy, vulnerable to collapse at any moment. For a brief period in the 1950s, that passage carried words that were never meant to be heard by their adversaries. Those words traveled through cables and steel and soil, into tape machines and reports, and eventually into history. When the Soviets finally broke into the chamber, when cameras flashed and cables were exposed, the tunnel ceased to be a secret. But it did not cease to matter. Its story continued, in the careers it shaped, in the doctrines it influenced, in the lessons whispered to new recruits. Even now, whenever an intelligence officer sits in a secure room and weighs the risks of a bold operation against the possibility of an unseen mole, a faint echo of the Berlin Tunnel is there. The soil has long since settled. The cables have been replaced. The men who dug the tunnel and the men who betrayed it are gone. But the questions remain. How much should a state know about its enemies? How far should it go to find out? And when the ground itself becomes a battlefield, who can ever be sure where the real line is drawn? Operation Gold, the CIA's tunnel gamble in Berlin, was doomed by a KGB mole. Yet, in its failure, it revealed the true shape of the secret war. Not a simple contest of winners and losers, but a tangled, dangerous game in which knowledge and ignorance, trust and betrayal, courage and overconfidence are forever intertwined beneath the surface of history,